The late afternoon sun slanted across the parking lot of a grocery store in Burlington, Vermont, casting long shadows between the parked cars. A man in his mid-30s knelt beside a stalled luxury sedan, his callous hands working beneath the open hood, while a woman in an impeccable charcoal suit stepped out from the driver's side. Her heels clicked against the asphalt with impatience, her voice sharp as she demanded to know how long this would take. He answered without looking up, his tone calm but clipped, making clear he had no interest in conversation. When he finally stood and wiped his hands on a rag, the woman tilted her head, studying his face with sudden intensity. Her breath caught, stuttering for half a beat, as though she had just seen a ghost she was not yet ready to believe in. For a moment, neither of them moved. The woman's lips parted, and a name escaped in a whisper, so quiet it might have been mistaken for the wind. But it was not a name. It was a nickname, something intimate and half-forgotten. A word that belonged to summer nights and youthful promises made on a porch swing 12 years ago. The man's hands stopped moving against the rag. His jaw tightened, and something flickered behind his eyes, a door slamming shut before anyone could see what lay beyond it. She said it again, louder this time, as if testing whether the sound would break the spell or confirm it. He looked at her fully now, and for the first time she could see the years etched into his face, the way life had carved lines around his mouth and left shadows beneath his eyes. He was not the boy she remembered, but he was unmistakably the same person, the same broad shoulders, the same quiet intensity in his gaze, the same scar running along the edge of his left hand, though she did not let herself look at that just yet. He shook his head slowly. "You've got the wrong person." His voice was flat, deliberately empty, but she had spent 12 years replaying every detail of his face in her memory, and she knew she was not wrong. She took a step closer, her composure cracking just enough to reveal something raw underneath. She asked him about a summer, about a promise, about a reason he never came back. Each word landed like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples across his expression that he fought to suppress. He did not answer. Instead, he folded the rag with mechanical precision and tucked it into his back pocket. His movements were unhurried, almost dismissive, as though she were a stranger, asking for directions he had no interest in providing. When he finally spoke again, his voice carried an edge that had not been there before. "That'll be $40 for the alternator. You can pay inside." She opened her mouth to protest, to push further, but something in his eyes warned her against it. There was pain there, buried deep but still smoldering, and she realized with a sinking feeling that whatever door she was trying to open, he had welded shut years ago. He turned and walked toward a dusty pickup truck parked at the far end of the lot, his gait unhurried but definite. She watched him go, rooted to the spot, her heart hammering against her ribs. She did not call out his nickname again. She did not chase after him. She simply stood there as the sun continued its slow descent, watching the man who had once been the center of her entire world walk away from her as though she meant nothing at all. Inside the sedan, her hands trembled against the steering wheel. The engine purred smoothly now, repaired by the very hands that had once held hers in the darkness of a Vermont summer night. She pressed her forehead against the cool leather and allowed herself to breathe in and out, trying to slow the racing of her thoughts. 12 years. It had been 12 years since she had seen his face, heard his voice, felt the particular weight of his presence beside her. She had built an entire life in his absence, climbed corporate ladders and shattered glass ceilings, accumulated wealth and influence, and all the markers of success that her father had promised would make her happy. None of it had. None of it had even come close. She remembered the day she left with perfect clarity, the way her father's driver had arrived at dawn, the way she had been given no choice but to pack a single bag and disappear before the town woke up. She remembered scribbling a note and slipping it under his door, explaining everything, begging him to understand. She remembered waiting for a response that never came. All these years she had assumed he received the note and simply chose not to forgive her. She had told herself it was better this way, that he had moved on, that she should do the same. But now, seeing the coldness in his eyes, she understood something far more devastating. He had no idea why she left. He thought she had simply abandoned him without a word. The realization hit her like a physical blow. She gripped the steering wheel until her knuckles turned white, fighting back tears that she had not allowed herself to cry in over a decade. Everything she believed about their ending was wrong. Every assumption, every rationalization, every late-night justification she had used to ease her guilt, it was all built on a lie. Meanwhile, he drove through the darkening streets toward the small garage he owned on the edge of town. His daughter was waiting for him there, probably sitting on the counter with a coloring book, while his business partner kept an eye on her. The thought of her face, her gap-toothed smile, her absolute certainty that her father could fix anything. It was the only thing that kept him grounded when the rest of the world threatened to spin out of control. He pulled into the gravel lot and cut the engine, but he did not get out immediately. He sat in the silence of the cab, staring at the scar on his left hand. It had faded over the years, but he could still trace its path from memory, still feel the phantom pain of the accident that had left it there. The accident that had taken everything from him, his scholarship, his future, his faith in the fundamental fairness of the world. And now she had reappeared, conjured out of nowhere, like a specter from a life he had spent years trying to bury. He did not know what game she was playing, and he did not want to find out. He had a daughter to raise, a business to run, a quiet existence that he had painstakingly rebuilt from the ashes of his former self. He was not about to let anyone, especially not her, disrupt that. But even as he told himself this, he could not shake the sound of her voice whispering that old nickname. It followed him as he climbed out of the truck and walked toward the garage, clinging to him like the scent of rain on dry earth. She sat in her car for nearly an hour after he left, watching the shadows lengthen across the parking lot. When she finally reached down to retrieve her phone from the passenger seat, her fingers brushed against something unfamiliar. A small leather wallet worn at the edges lying on the floor mat, where it must have fallen from his pocket when he leaned across to check her engine. She picked it up with trembling hands and opened it before she could stop herself. Inside, behind a creased driver's license bearing his name and a Burlington address, there was a photograph. It showed him sitting on the steps of a modest porch, his arm wrapped around a little girl with honeycombed hair and his exact same eyes. The child was grinning at the camera with unguarded joy, and he was looking at her with an expression of such profound tenderness that it made something crack open in the center of her chest. He had a daughter. He had built a life without her, found happiness, or at least the semblance of it, become a father. She stared at the photograph until the details blurred, until she could no longer tell where her tears ended and the image began. All those years of wondering what became of him, and here was the answer clutched in her hands. He had survived. He had kept going. He had found something worth living for. The morning sun streamed through the open bay doors of his garage, illuminating dust motes that floated lazily in the warm air. He was underneath a vintage Ford, tracing a brake line with practiced fingers. When the conversation around him suddenly stopped, his partner cleared his throat in a way that carried a warning, and the two younger mechanics fell silent with almost comical abruptness. He slid out from beneath the car and looked toward the entrance. She stood framed against the morning light, her designer clothes a stark contrast to the grease-stained concrete floor. The wallet was in her hand, and she extended it toward him with a small, uncertain gesture that bore no resemblance to the imperious woman who had demanded repairs in a parking lot the day before. He got to his feet slowly, wiping his hands on his work shirt, his expression unreadable. The other men in the garage pretended to focus on their tasks, but he could feel their curiosity radiating like heat. He crossed the distance between them and took the wallet without a word, checking its contents with the methodical care of someone who had learned not to trust easily. She spoke before he could turn away. Her voice was softer now, stripped of the corporate sharpness that had characterized their first encounter. She told him she had found it in her car, that she thought he might be looking for it, that she was sorry to intrude on his workplace. Each word was careful, measured, as though she were navigating a minefield, and any wrong step could end in disaster. He thanked her with the same flat politeness he might offer a stranger returning a dropped glove. He made no move to continue the conversation, no gesture that might invite her to stay. But she did not leave. She stood her ground, her eyes searching his face for some crack in the armor, some sign that the connection they had once shared still existed beneath the surface. Then her gaze dropped to the wallet in his hands, and her voice softened even further. "You have a daughter now." It was not a question, but the words hung in the air between them with all the weight of one. He felt his composure slip for just a moment, a flicker of vulnerability crossing his features before he could suppress it. His daughter was the one subject he could not discuss with clinical detachment, the one part of his life that remained untouched by the cynicism he had cultivated as a shield against further pain. He tucked the wallet into his back pocket and met her eyes. "That's not any of your business." She flinched slightly at the coldness in his voice, but she did not retreat. Instead, she nodded slowly, accepting the boundary he had drawn while making clear she was not ready to walk away entirely. She told him she was staying in town for a few days, that she was dealing with some business matters at her father's company headquarters nearby. She said it casually as though it were simple small talk, but they both knew what she was really saying. She would be around. She was not disappearing this time. He said nothing in response. He simply stood there, arms folded across his chest, until she finally turned and walked back toward the entrance. But at the threshold, she paused and looked back over her shoulder. Her expression was raw in a way that surprised him, stripped of artifice, full of things she clearly wanted to say, but could not yet find the words for. Then she was gone, and the garage erupted in whispered speculation that he silenced with a single sharp look. He returned to the car he had been working on and slid back underneath, but his hands were not as steady as they had been before. Somewhere in the dim recesses of his chest, a door he had thought permanently sealed was rattling against its hinges. She returned the next afternoon, and the one after that. She did not ask to speak with him directly, seeming to understand that such a request would be refused. Instead, she found reasons to be nearby. A coffee from the shop across the street, a question about her car's performance since the repair. Each time, he kept their interactions brief and impersonal, offering nothing beyond the bare minimum of courtesy. But she was patient. She had learned patience in boardrooms, where men twice her age tried to dismiss her. In negotiations that stretched across months, in the slow and grueling process of building a reputation that could not be ignored. She applied that same patience now, wearing down his resistance, not through confrontation, but through simple, persistent presence. On the fourth day, she arrived to find the garage quiet. His partner was out on a parts run. The other mechanics had gone to lunch, and he was alone in the office, reviewing invoices with his daughter perched beside him, her small legs swinging from the edge of his desk as she worked on a drawing. She stopped in the doorway, arrested by the scene. The little girl noticed her first. She looked up with the frank curiosity of childhood and asked who she was. Her father's head snapped toward the door, his expression darkening. But before he could speak, the child had already slid off the desk and approached with hand outstretched. "I'm Lily," she announced. "I'm 7. My dad fixes cars. Do you have a car that needs fixing?" She crouched down to meet the child at eye level, something softening in her features that he had never seen before. She told Lily her name and shook the small hand with grave formality. She said she was an old friend of her father's from a long time ago. Lily considered this information with the seriousness of a judge reviewing evidence. "You must be a pretty old friend," Lily concluded. "Dad doesn't have very many of those." He intervened then, his voice gentle but firm, as he told Lily to go finish her drawing. The child obeyed reluctantly, casting curious glances over her shoulder as she returned to the desk. He stepped outside, gesturing for her to follow, and they stood in the shadow of the building where Lily could not hear them. "You need to stop coming here." His voice was low, controlled. "Whatever you think you're doing, it's not going to work." She met his gaze without flinching. "I'm not trying to do anything except talk to you to explain what happened. I don't need your explanations. I figured it out a long time ago." The bitterness in his voice was sharp enough to cut. "You left. That's all that matters." She shook her head slowly, and for the first time he saw tears gathering at the corners of her eyes. She told him she never wanted to leave, that she was given no choice, that her father had orchestrated the entire thing while she was powerless to stop it. Her voice cracked as she described the morning she was taken, the note she had left for him, the years she spent believing he had read it and chosen not to respond. He listened with his arms crossed, his expression guarded, giving nothing away. When she finished, he was silent for a long moment. Then he said very quietly, "There was no note." The words hit her like a blow. She stared at him, uncomprehending as the implications cascaded through her mind. No note. He had never received it. All these years, he thought she had simply vanished without a word, without explanation, without any indication that their time together had meant anything at all. "My father," she whispered. "He must have intercepted it." He said nothing, but something shifted behind his eyes. The anger was still there, but now it was joined by a weary kind of understanding, as though a puzzle piece he had been missing for 12 years had finally clicked into place. He uncrossed his arms and looked away toward the distant mountains that ringed the valley, and for a moment he seemed very far away. She did not press him. She simply stood beside him in silence, allowing the weight of the revelation to settle between them. When he finally spoke again, his voice was quieter, less defensive. "Why did he do it? Why did he care so much about keeping us apart?" She took a deep breath. This was the part she had been dreading, the truth she had only recently begun to understand herself. She told him about her father's world, the rigid class distinctions he enforced, the absolute certainty that his daughter deserved someone with wealth and status and proper credentials. A mechanic's son from a small Vermont town did not fit that vision, no matter how much she loved him. But there was more. Her voice dropped to nearly a whisper as she told him what her father had believed about the accident, the one that had left the scar on his hand, the one that had derailed his scholarship and destroyed his chances at the future he had been building. Her father had been convinced, based on reports she now knew were falsified, that he was responsible, that he had been driving recklessly, that he had caused the crash that injured his own mother. He turned to look at her, and for the first time she saw naked pain in his expression, unguarded and raw. "Your father thought I hurt my own mother." She nodded miserably. "He used it to justify everything, keeping me away from you, making sure we never had contact. He said he was protecting me from someone who would only bring me down." He was quiet for a long time after that. She watched him struggle with emotions he had spent years learning to suppress, watched the walls around him tremble, but not quite fall. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough. "I didn't cause that accident. A driver ran a red light and hit us broadside. I've got the police report, the insurance records, everything. I was cleared of any responsibility. I believe you." The words came out fierce, certain. "I should have known. I should have questioned it years ago. But I was young and scared, and my father was so sure." She trailed off, shaking her head. "That's not an excuse. I should have fought harder." He did not respond to that. Perhaps there was nothing to say. Instead, he turned and walked back toward the garage, toward his daughter, and his work, and the life he had built without her. But at the door, he paused. "Your father," he said slowly. "He's a powerful man. If he manipulated evidence about the accident, there might be records somewhere. Proof of what really happened." She understood immediately what he was suggesting. It was not forgiveness. Not yet, but it was an opening. A crack in the wall through which something new might eventually grow. She nodded, and something that might have been determination settled into her expression. "I'll find out," she said. "Whatever he did, I'll find the truth." That evening, she sat alone in her hotel room, surrounded by documents she had spent the afternoon gathering. Her father's company had offices in Burlington, ostensibly for a manufacturing plant that had been acquired decades ago. But the more she dug into the records, the more she realized how much business passed through those offices that had nothing to do with manufacturing. She found the accident report first. It was buried in a file that should have been purged years ago, a copy retained by someone who understood the value of keeping leverage on powerful people. The original report she now saw had been amended several times before its official filing. Witness statements had been revised. The timeline had been adjusted, and in the margins of one draft, in handwriting she recognized as belonging to her father's longtime attorney, there was a note. "CW wants this handled quietly. The boy needs to be discredited." C. Christopher Wells. Her father. She felt sick as she continued reading. The real story emerged in fragments. A company driver behind the wheel of a delivery truck had run the light while rushing to meet a deadline. The truck had struck the carrying her first love and his mother, leaving her with injuries that would take years to fully heal. The driver had been an employee of her father's company, operating a vehicle that had not been properly maintained. If the truth had come out, the liability would have been devastating, so her father had buried it. He had used his influence to shift blame onto a 17-year-old boy, destroying his scholarship prospects and his reputation in one calculated stroke. And when that same boy had the audacity to fall in love with his daughter, he had separated them with equal ruthlessness, intercepting letters and erasing any chance of reconciliation. She gathered the documents with trembling hands. Tomorrow she would confront her father. But first, she needed to process the magnitude of what she had discovered. The man she had respected and feared and tried so desperately to please. He was a monster, and she had been his unwitting accomplice for far too long. The confrontation took place in her father's office at the Burlington facility, a room designed to intimidate with its floor-to-ceiling windows and its walls lined with awards and photographs of handshakes with senators. He sat behind his massive desk, looking at her with the patient condescension of someone who had grown accustomed to winning every battle. She placed the documents in front of him without preamble. She watched his expression flicker as he recognized what they contained, watched him calculate how to spin this in his favor. But before he could speak, she told him exactly what she knew. The cover-up, the falsified reports, the systematic destruction of an innocent young man's future to protect corporate interests. Her father leaned back in his chair, his expression hardening. "You're making accusations you can't prove. Those documents could be forged, could be misinterpreted. Do you really want to go down this road?" She did not waver. "I've already gone down it. I've had the documents authenticated by independent experts. I've traced the timeline, talked to witnesses you thought you had silenced. Everything points to one conclusion. You destroyed his life to cover your company's negligence." For the first time in her memory, she saw fear flicker across her father's face, but it was quickly replaced by something harder, more desperate. He told her that going public with this would destroy them both, that she would lose her position, her inheritance, everything she had worked for. He warned her that she was throwing away her entire future for a man who meant nothing. She stood her ground. "He doesn't mean nothing. He never did. And I'm not going to let you keep hurting him just because you can." Her father's face contorted with rage. He told her she was being foolish, that she was letting emotion cloud her judgment, that she would regret this for the rest of her life. But beneath the anger, she could see something else. The dawning realization that for the first time, she was not going to back down. She walked out of his office without looking back. Her hands were shaking and her heart was pounding, but there was a clarity in her chest that she had not felt in years. She knew what she needed to do next. She found him that evening at his garage alone again, bent over an engine with the focused concentration she remembered from years ago. He looked up as she approached, and something in his expression shifted when he saw her face. He straightened slowly, wiping his hands on a rag, waiting for her to speak. She told him everything. The documents she had found, the confrontation with her father, the full scope of what had been done to him and why. She did not try to soften it or make excuses. She simply laid out the truth, ugly and unvarnished, and let him process it in his own time. He was silent for a long while after she finished. She watched emotions chase across his face: shock, grief, anger, and finally, something that looked almost like relief. He turned away from her, bracing his hands against the workbench, his shoulders tight with tension. "All these years," he said quietly, "I thought it was my fault. I thought I had somehow caused the accident, that everyone who blamed me was right. I carried that weight every single day." She moved closer, not quite touching him, but close enough that he could feel her presence. "You were innocent. You were always innocent. And I'm so sorry it took me this long to prove it." He turned to face her, and she saw that his eyes were bright with unshed tears. But he was not crying from sadness. He was crying because something inside him, Something that had been clenched tight for 12 years was finally beginning to let go. He looked at her for a long moment, really looked at her, and she felt the weight of his gaze like a physical thing. He was searching for something in her face, some sign that would tell him whether he could trust what he was seeing. And she let him look. She had nothing left to hide. "Why did you do this?" His voice was rough. "You could have just walked away. Pretended you never saw me in that parking lot. It would have been easier." She shook her head slowly. "I've spent 12 years taking the easy way, telling myself that what happened was in the past, that there was nothing I could do to change it. But that was a lie. I could have fought for you back then. And I didn't. I was too scared of my father, too afraid of losing everything I thought I wanted." She stepped closer, close enough to touch if she dared. "I'm not scared anymore, and I'm not going to let fear keep me from doing what's right. Not ever again." He studied her face in the fading light, and something in his expression began to soften. The walls were still there, but they were no longer impenetrable. They were beginning to show cracks, places where light could finally get through. He did not say anything else. He did not need to. The silence between them was no longer hostile or defensive. It was simply quiet. The kind of quiet that comes when two people are finally ready to hear each other. It was late when she finally left the garage, long after the sun had set and the stars had begun to emerge above the mountains. She drove back to her hotel with a strange lightness in her chest, a feeling she barely recognized. It was hope, fragile and uncertain, but unmistakably there. The next few weeks passed in a blur of legal consultations and difficult conversations. She worked with attorneys to prepare a case against her father's company, one that would expose the cover-up and ensure that he could never use his power to hurt anyone else the way he had hurt the man she loved. It was brutal, exhausting work, and more than once she questioned whether she was doing the right thing. But then she would remember the look on his face when she told him the truth. She would remember the weight lifting from his shoulders, the tears in his eyes, the way he had finally allowed himself to stop carrying a burden that was never his to bear. And she would find the strength to keep going. He began to let her into his life in small ways. A coffee here, a conversation there, always in public places where his daughter could run around, and the stakes felt lower. He was cautious, still guarded, but he was no longer pushing her away entirely, and with each small opening, she proved that she was worthy of the trust he was slowly beginning to offer. One afternoon, she arrived at the diner where they had agreed to meet and found him already seated, his daughter beside him with crayons scattered across the table. Lily looked up with a bright smile when she saw her, and she felt something warm bloom in her chest at the welcome. She slid into the booth across from them and watched as Lily showed off her latest drawing, a picture of a car with flowers growing out of the hood. She praised the artwork with genuine admiration, and Lily beamed with the uncomplicated joy of a child who has found a receptive audience. He watched the interaction with an expression she could not quite read. But when Lily got up to use the restroom, he leaned across the table and spoke in a low voice. "She likes you. That's not easy. She's been through a lot, and she doesn't trust people." Quickly, she felt the significance of his words like a gift. Neither does her father. He acknowledged the point with a slight nod. "No, he doesn't." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, and then he said something that made her heart stop. "I've been thinking about what you said, about not being scared anymore, about doing what's right even when it's hard." She waited, barely breathing. "I think I've been scared, too, for a long time. Scared of letting anyone in, scared of getting hurt again, scared of believing that good things could actually happen." He paused, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her shiver. "But I'm tired of being scared. I'm tired of letting the past dictate my future." She reached across the table and took his hand. His fingers were rough and calloused, marked by years of labor, but they curled around hers with surprising gentleness. "Then let's is less than is greater than stop being scared together," she said softly. "Let's see what happens when we actually give this a chance." He did not answer immediately. But when Lily returned to the table, chattering about something she had seen on the way to the bathroom, she noticed that he did not let go of her hand. He simply adjusted his grip, making room for both connections in his life. The night was quiet when he finished working on the last car of the day. The garage was empty, the tools put away. The bay doors closed against the cooling autumn air. He was wiping down the workbench when he heard footsteps behind him and turned to find her standing in the doorway. She was backlit by the street lamps outside, her features soft in the dim light. She did not speak at first. She simply stood there looking at him with an expression that held 12 years of longing and regret and hope all tangled together. Then she said his name. Not his real name, not the formal address she had used in their recent conversations, but the nickname, the one she had whispered in a parking lot weeks ago, the one that belonged to summer nights and youthful promises. Her voice trembled slightly, but her gaze was steady and sure. He set down the rag and turned to face her fully. For a moment, neither of them moved. The distance between them felt both immense and impossibly small, a gap that could be crossed with a single step or left unbridged forever. "You're still here," he said quietly. It was not quite a question. She nodded. "I'm still here." He took a breath, and something in his posture shifted. The tension that had held his shoulders rigid began to ease. The guardedness in his eyes softened into something more open, more vulnerable than she had seen since they were teenagers. "This time," he said slowly, "don't disappear." She crossed the distance between them in 3 quick steps. Her hands found his face, cradling his jaw with a tenderness that made his breath catch. Her eyes were bright with tears, but she was smiling. "Never again," she said. He let out a long breath, and finally, the last of his walls came down. He pulled her into his arms and held her close, and she felt 12 years of loneliness and longing dissolve into something new, something that felt like hope, like healing, like the beginning of a story they had waited far too long to write. Outside, the stars wheeled slowly overhead, indifferent to the small miracles happening in the garage below. But for the two people holding each other in the quiet of the night, the universe had never felt more precisely perfectly aligned.